Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Network 2020's discussion today about the Wagner Group. We have a wonderful panel with us today, and before I introduce them, I just wanted to say a few words about Network 2020. So my name is Courtney Doggart. I'm the president of Network 2020. We are an inclusive international community, and we're really focused on bridging the gap between the private sector and the international affairs community. We run a lot of briefings like these ones. We also do other educational programs. We have foreign affairs discussion groups. We do research abroad. We implement programs for the State Department. So we're doing a lot of different activities. Please do check us out. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, whatever, LinkedIn, whichever platform is your platform of choice. So, and thank you all for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to introduce our panelists today. First, we have Pauline Bax, and she was the senior editor and policy advisor and is now the Africa Program Deputy Director at the International Crisis Group. So she has a lot of on-the-ground experience regarding what we will be talking about today. Next up, we have Dr. Kimberly Marten, and she is a faculty member at Columbia's Harriman Institute for Russian, Eurasian, and East European Studies, and is at Barnard College as well. Her current research focuses on the politics of the changing Arctic. And previously, she has done a lot of work on the Wagner Group. In fact, I believe the first time I really heard about them was at a discussion at Columbia, actually. So years and years ago. So she's been a forerunner there. And then last but not least, we have Jack Margolin, and he is a program director at C4ADS, which is a nonprofit that uses publicly available information . It says my discussion today. She has her PhD from Oxford. She has been a policy advisor to a number of congressional candidates, and she's worked in nonprofits and is a senior program advisor at Network 2020. So welcome everyone, and thank you so much. We're very pleased to have you today. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to you, Joanna.
Great. Thank you so much, Courtney. Today, we will be discussing what is the Wagner Group, how it operates around the world, and whether or not it has been successful in achieving President Vladimir Putin's objectives. What purpose in general does the group serve for Russian foreign policy? Does the group provide certain advantages to Moscow, such as deniability, that the use of a national army cannot? This mercenary network has an obvious military purpose, but are there some other roles that it also plays? Conversely, what challenges does the group raise within the countries that it operates, such as Ukraine, Syria, Mali, and in other parts of Africa? And are we likely to see more use of the Wagner Group by Russia in the future, and where might that be? I look forward to our conversation this afternoon on these and other questions with our distinguished panel. So first, I would like to turn to you, Kim. Could you please provide some background on who is the Wagner Group, when it came into existence, and how it has evolved? And also, what purpose does it serve for Russian foreign policy?
Sure. Thanks, Joanna, and thanks, Courtney, for inviting me. That you've listed a very large group of questions, so let me start at the beginning. The Wagner Group in its current form emerged in 2014 in Eastern Ukraine, in Crimea. It has evolved a lot since then. It is not the same organization in various places in the world that it is involved. And so rather than thinking of it as a group or as an organization, we should think of it as a contracting mechanism for use by the Russian Military Intelligence Agency, the GRU. In 2016, we first understood that Yevgeny Prigozhin was involved as the contractor. It's not clear that he's been involved in their activities in Ukraine, but he certainly has in Syria and throughout Africa. And along with his contracting of the personnel, he has engaged in various kinds of oil and mineral contracting in various places where it's been deployed to guard various locations where Russia has engaged as a contractor for providing security for those facilities. And let me see if I can remember your other questions that all came at once. The major purpose it serves, I think, is to avoid casualties for regular Russian military forces. It may have started out as having a plausible deniability role for the international audience, but I think now it's followed by investigative journalists and by UN officials and other government officials so closely wherever it goes that the plausible deniability is really for the at-home audience. And it is to avoid casualties in either actions like Ukraine, where there is a lot of death happening, but in Syria and in Africa, also to allow Russia to be experimental in terms of what it does in its security policy without putting Russian conscripts at risk. Russia still has a military draft.
Great, thank you so much, Kim. And with this concept of what the evolution of the contracting mechanism, which is interesting, it's an interesting perspective on it. Paulina, what are some of the activities of the group in various countries, including its political, military, and economic roles? And in addition, is it a stabilizing or a destabilizing force mainly?
Well, there's a timeline to it. I think the most visible Wagner presence and the most written about Wagner presence has so far been in Central African Republic, which is a highly unstable country which has been in conflict for many years, almost 2 decades of rebel activity on the countryside. Wagner arrived there to help build up the national army, which was pretty much in shambles, and to provide security, protection to the president, as well as helping the army to fight the rebels off. I think when it first arrived, that wasn't maybe not really the strategy, but it ended up, Wagner has now ended up sort of evolved over 3 years as the main force leading the army into combat, fighting on the ground, as well as providing personal security to the presidency and the people and the government. So it's arrived as a military force. It now has a large political influence. Wagner operatives are seen in the halls of ministerial buildings. Wagner operatives are discussing with the president. Of course, this is all fairly secretive, so we don't know what they are discussing, but it has a large political influence that many people are very worried about. And it has now also it's starting to have economic influence in the sense that it is extracting natural resources, and it's starting to play a fairly large economic role. An economic role, of course, from the beginning was the goal, because Wagner troops need to be paid somehow. And fairly early on, there were several mining concessions given to Wagner-linked companies. And by this point, I think Wagner troops are involved in, gold mining or securing gold mines, timber trades. I even heard reports about coffee growing now, not that they grow coffee themselves, but they may have several concessions in that field. So Central African Republic has been sort of a test case, I think, for Wagner's presence in Africa. It's arrived earlier on in Mozambique, but that was a failure. They withdrew after a couple of months. There's Wagner troops in Sudan. And as we all know, recently Wagner arrived in, not so recently anymore, 6 months ago, they arrived in Mali, where their role up until now is primarily military. So they help to, they're there to fight the jihadist insurgencies. If that's going to extend into a political economic role, that's not quite sure, and that we'll have to see if they can roll out the same playbook that they have worked to a finesse or have worked out in CAR. But I think that's sort of the overall idea of how Wagner would like to be present in other countries as well. But all that said, Central African Republic is quite an unusual country in that it's been exceptionally unstable for a long time. It's extremely poor, one of the poorest countries, if not the poorest country in the world. So I think that all has been fairly simple for them, well, not simple, but it has been fairly easy and quite smooth for them. And if they can really repeat that model or replicate that model in other countries remains to be seen.
And do you find that it's been mostly a destabilizing force in the countries that it's been present in?
Well, Wagner was actually quite stabilizing because they did help train national soldiers. They did help build up the army, and they led an offensive against rebels that was fairly successful from a military point of view in the first 6 months of 2021. They regained territory that the government hadn't been able to control for many years, and it seemed to be a stabilizing force to an extent in the beginning. However, now the rebels have come back in force. The Wagner troops that are there are probably only about 1,000 men, if not less, and that's really not enough to stabilize the country.
Okay, thank you. And then I wanted to just drill down further with you, Jack, about what type of military involvement does the Wagner Group have in various countries, and does it differ from place to place? And there is one aspect, such as the assistance in Mali, for example, that is welcomed, obviously, by the government, while we see in Ukraine that they're seeing it as their presence is seen as a violation of sovereignty. So can you talk a little bit about the militarily what the Wagner Group does in these various countries?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Joanna. And I'll say that our organization's work at C4DS, we're really focused on sort of investigating the networks and using publicly available information to document activity. So we are deeply indebted to the work that Dr. Marten has done, mapping out the sort of history of these networks, and what Pauline has done to contextualize and really dig deeper on what Wagner's involvement means in countries like the Central African Republic, which I think help us get away from a tendency that we see in some places to sort of paint these activities with a broad brush. So it's important to keep in mind their history, the network, and also the interactions that these networks have with their partners on the ground. Yeah, absolutely. The sort of package of services that Wagner offers and what their military activity looks like in different countries varies case by case. Important to understanding why that is the case and the different types of packages that we see in different places, I think, is really to keep in mind what Kim pointed out earlier, which is that Wagner effectively is a contracting mechanism. Prigozhin provides a corporate infrastructure that supports finance and logistics for operations that can be used for direct combat support, training, a variety of other purposes that are principally being administered by Russian military intelligence. So within the sort of spectrum of services that Wagner provides on the military side, we see everything from training, so working alongside local forces in Central African Republic is everything from the gendarmerie to the FACA, the actual armed forces, the country itself, to engaging in combat directly. And that can be either partnered with local military as well as non-state armed groups, local militias, and even local private military companies. Principally in Syria, we saw a lot of this activity with private military companies which are principally set up for the reason of doing business with Russian PMCs, but which nonetheless were an important part of their ability to collaborate with local forces and places like Deir ez-Zor. Recently, some of those companies on the Syrian side were actually designated by the European Union. So there is this sort of spectrum of either more sort of rear echelon side, helping out these forces and upskilling them, as well as deploying directly with them, either state or non-state forces. In Ukraine, this is obviously a bit different, and part of that is because part of the advantage that Wagner offers with this semi-privatized structure that's pulled largely from Prigozhin's extended corporate network doesn't really offer a lot of the same advantages, or it offers them in a different way. So in Africa and Syria, those networks can offer the ability for Wagner to effectively integrate with local commercial and political constituencies by creating companies that not only generate revenue, but also let them engage with communities in politics there and in business there. It can give them additional leverage, additional contacts, et cetera. In Ukraine, that is not an advantage that Wagner really has to bring to bear. And I think it's also important to consider that the sort of larger scope of the lineage of Russian PMCs is also very present in Ukraine. So it's very instructive to look at Kim's earlier paper regarding sort of everything from Slavonic Corps and RSB Group, et cetera, to understand some of the actors that are now involved in Ukraine. It's not just what we would term Wagner. It's a variety of other structures that are used largely for recruiting, essentially from across Russia in order to staff Russia's invasion of Ukraine. They're still using a lot of Wagner infrastructure. Meduza, a Russian language investigative outlet, has published some really great reporting on this recently that sort of documents the timeline of Wagner Prigozhin network involvement in the invasion of Ukraine. But they're principally being used in order to recruit for this effort, alongside everything from contracting to regular Ministry of Defense, recruitment through what they refer to as volunteer battalions. But all of that effectively is to have more young men to send to the front and to do it deniably. And many of these cases, we're seeing that there are reporting, particularly from Russian investigative media, that these sort of PMC recruits are forming some of the more essential assault forces that are being used at the front lines in some of the areas that are most likely for them to incur losses. And quite a bit of reporting about recruitment from places like prisons indicates that the expectations for losses for these Russian PMCs is quite high. So in these cases, I think we can see that it offers a pretty different advantage. It's a very different sort of MO that's being employed by the same or similar infrastructure. But all of it serves to benefit the Russian government and the Russian military by providing them advantages that they can't get through more conventional deployments.
Great, thank you so much, Jack. Then Kim, if I can turn to you, we see this week that Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is in Africa this week. There's going to be a Russian-African summit sometime in the fall. So we see that Putin appears to be wanting to expand the Russian presence, the Wagner Group's presence in Africa. What purpose do you see, or what are the objectives do you think Putin has for Africa?
Okay. Well, Putin is trying to catch up with everybody else in Africa. Russia is a relatively small player in Africa compared to the United States, the European Union, China, India, some of the Arab states. So Russia's trying to catch up in Africa. It's trying to sort of pick up the pieces where nobody else wants to get involved. And throughout Africa, one of the underlying political purposes we see where the Wagner Group has been deployed is for Russia to become a necessary security player in countries that are unstable. So as Pauline talked about in the Central African Republic, we see something maybe similar emerging now in Mali. There was an effort to do that in Mozambique that, as Pauline said, failed miserably. But the goal is to sort of insert Russia through the Wagner Group into being the balancer that keeps various domestic factions loyal to the government. Beyond that, I mean, that's really the primary political purpose, I think, that we've seen Wagner serving.
All right, thank you. And then Paulina, if I can ask you, what has been the impact of the Wagner Group on human rights in the countries where they operate? And also, how do the governments balance the presence of the Wagner Group with Western assistance and donor programs? How does that dynamic work?
Yeah, well, in CAR, the problem in recent months that has come to the surface is of consistent human rights violations, torture, rape, summary executions, and increasingly, it sounds a bit funny, but small-scale massacres where, 10, 12, 20, 30 people are killed at once, often after or during activities by Wagner mercenaries. In CAR specifically, they use helicopters often to scout out specific areas, usually mining areas, where artisanal miners are being killed. Those instances of rape and summary executions came to the fore quite early on and were reported about by the UN at first. The UN has documented many rights abuses because, of course, the UN has a big peacekeeping mission in CAR. I need to specify that. Again, human rights abuses on the countryside in Central African Republic is not something that is highly unusual, but just the brutality that Wagner troops have used is I think is fairly unusual, if I should say. And then in Mali, there was a late March, there was a very large massacre in a town called Moura, which has been documented by groups including Human Rights Watch, where national soldiers together with foreign forces or bilateral forces, they're usually called, but white men in uniforms, so assuming they were Wagner troops, were seen to kill about 300 men, mostly of one specific ethnic group in a village over the course of about 4 days. And so, you know, it goes back to Wagner's proposition in the 2 African countries that I've mentioned, is basically we come in and we will kill the bad guys for you. And that really seems to be their proposition. And there are no conditions on how we do this. We just get rid of the problem for you. Maybe not in those stark terms, but that has apparently been a very attractive proposition for the governments both in Central African Republic and in Mali.
All right.
Sorry, I forgot your second question.
Yeah, the second
so
question.
How do Western donors balance that? Well, it's impossible to balance. Again, we have to compare, not compare, but the timeline is, you know, CAR first and now Mali, where I said earlier they tried to replicate sort of that model that they had in Central African Republic. Western donors have decided that they can't work really with a government that employs Wagner because budget support or fuel or any kind of military aid risks getting into the hands of Wagner operatives. And it's a huge reputational risk, and European or Western countries don't want to be seen as supporting a completely unaccountable Russian military group. So CAR has now been sort of frozen out of support. The country is close to economic collapse. It may the government may be able to hold out until the end of the year, but you know, there's a huge risk of the government not being able to pay its civil servants. There's a fuel shortage. There's all kinds of issues, and that's a huge dilemma for donors who still want to provide either humanitarian aid or bring some kind of relief and some kind of economic stability and also political stability to a country. Mali has had the same issue, where the moment that the government was known or reported as speaking with Wagner and bringing in Russian help, most donors said, well, if you're going to do that, France first said we can't have a stabilization force, a military force here while you bring in Wagner Group. And then we have to withdraw. And to many people's surprise, Mali decided to go ahead with tighter Russian military cooperation, to put it that way. And France is withdrawing its own troops now, and there are issues with, well, there's sanctions issues. Well, the European Union has sanctioned Wagner. Mali has been frozen out of a lot of aid, and again, it's a huge dilemma for Western donors, but we see in those 2 countries that Western donors, they have to provide some kind of humanitarian assistance and some kind of economic assistance. But when Wagner comes in, they have realized now, especially in the context of the invasion in Ukraine, that it is impossible and they can't risk it.
Right. Thank you so much. And then if I can turn to you, Jack, how does the Wagner Group financially benefit from its host countries? Is it through arms sales? Is it resource access? If you could just talk a little bit about how they economically, how they draw benefits from their presence in these host countries.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think sort of similar to my last response, and something that's been emphasized by all of us, is this really varies quite a bit from country to country. By virtue of the fact that Wagner can be flexible. The other thing worth keeping in mind is that this is not truly a private company. It is not subject to the same sort of market imperatives that a more conventional private military and security company might be, given the fact that it has the support of the Russian government. So that gives Wagner this ability to extend itself for engagements that might be, at least at first, unprofitable. So to give an idea of the kind of spectrum of different ways that Wagner generates revenue and the purposes for that, this network was really, really successful in doing this in Syria. And part of that was because of these really strong, long-standing business ties between Russian businessmen and Syrian businessmen and the Syrian government. And because of that, Prigozhin was able to basically use this, and the fact that he held this portfolio for supporting this broader PMC network to effectively appoint himself one of the leading Russian businessmen in engagement with the Syrian commercial sector. So if you look at very important sort of Russian business leaders in Syria right now, Prigozhin and Gennady Timchenko and his sort of Stroytransgas networks, their infrastructure is extremely important to that relationship. Now, because of that, also because there was a large demand for Russia to secure particularly extraction sites, extinguish wildfires, etc. The Russian government and Prigozhin were able to extract some pretty outrageous concessions and terms for effectively their contract for liberating oil fields and subsequently supporting the resumption of extraction of oil and natural gas. In that case, it was fairly, I guess you could say it was fairly standard as like there's a contract here for you will get you will liberate these oil fields. We will begin extraction again. Where it becomes unusual is they were basically being compensated through the revenue from the extracted natural resources, and Prigozhin's corporate infrastructure, namely this company called Yevropolis LLC, which is designated by the US Treasury, was entitled to a certain percentage of oil revenues. And if those oil revenues were not available, there was basically a flat fee that they would extract. In places like Sudan and the Central African Republic, those networks had to be a little bit more flexible because there wasn't the same sort of infrastructure opportunity set up for immediate financial success. In Sudan, in the early days, we really see that the sort of Prigozhin and Wagner related corporate infrastructure involved principally in gold mining struggled to get up on its feet. They lacked real awareness of the local market. They lacked awareness of the local actors. Early efforts that they made to create a successful mining enterprise were sort of bumbling. They poached some talent from existing Russian mining companies in the region. It's also worth emphasizing that Wagner is not the only player in this game. There are other Russia-based consortiums or Russia-based companies that are engaged in natural resources business across Africa. And through that, they were able to basically upskill themselves. And over time, they've developed a much more successful enterprise that's been documented recently in a much more sort of mature phase. Similarly, in the Central African Republic, which Pauline can describe, I think, in much greater detail than I can, being much more aware of the local dynamics. Similarly, they were able to, through their local connections, through relationships that they built in country, establish corporate infrastructure of business that's much more likely to be profitable. I think it's too early to say for certain what this looks like in the Mali context, but I will note that there are some kind of unusual exceptions to this rule. While there are opportunities for business related to natural resource extraction in places like Libya and in Mozambique, those weren't necessarily a chief aim of the business, at least not in documentation that we see from publicly available information or in investigative media reporting. So in places like Libya, there are perhaps angles to the business that involve securing specific key sites related to oil and natural gas, or other mineral resource extractive activities, hydrocarbons, et cetera. But that doesn't seem to be their primary emphasis. That comes along with other sorts of idiosyncrasies of these particular deployments, particularly in Libya, where we see Wagner combatants doing things like flying missions aboard MiG and Sukhoi fighter aircraft, which is extremely unusual to consider a private company doing, particularly when based in Russia. And I think is another piece of very important evidence in understanding their relationship with the Ministry of Defense and particularly military intelligence. So there is this sort of, I would say, broad spectrum of commercial activity that Wagner engages in. The other thing I would emphasize is something I alluded to earlier, which is that the principal aim of these business activities is revenue generation. That is important. There needs to be some kind of compensation, particularly for Prigozhin and taking on this portfolio. I term this broadly a portfolio, providing the corporate, the financial, the logistical infrastructure to support this activity deniably abroad. But there's also a set of sort of strategic aims that are satisfied by this, by appearing in country alongside Russia-based mining or hydrocarbons enterprise, or even timber enterprises we've seen recently, as Pauline has alluded to in Central African Republic. they're able to integrate more effectively with the local political economy and the actors that are important in that local political economy. In the Sudan case, we can see this kind of explicitly represented through the relationship between the Wagner Group and the Rapid Support Forces, which is a immensely influential paramilitary organization in Sudan. Wagner grew that relationship through its investments, not only into security assistance, but also mining prior to the 2019 revolution in Sudan. And by all accounts has sought to maintain that relationship through similarly military assistance and those commercial relationships. So this provides a sort of important venue for Wagner to engage politically and commercially with key actors in these countries and establish influence through means beyond simply providing security assistance that's not available from other internationals, and which comes with many less strings attached and conditions than we're used to seeing from other internationals engaging in these countries. So it's a complicated answer to a complicated question.
Great. No, thank you so much. Greatly appreciated. So now I'm going to turn to the Q&A. And I'm going to address this to you, Kim. It's following up on something Jack said about this idea of how the Russian government, the fine line between the Russian government and the Wagner Group, how that is displayed. And so the question is from one person is, how closely is Wagner linked to the Kremlin and the Russian army? And what is Putin's relationship to that group?
Sure. So before I get to that question, I just want to follow up on something that Jack just said that answers Nikita Kozhemyakin's question in the Q&A about our source material. Jack's group, C4ADS, does a wonderful job of finding all kinds of economic, contractual, and big data information to use in this. In addition to that, there's been a couple of terrific reporters inside Russia, investigative reporters. One is Denis Karatkov and one is Lilia Yaporova. It has become more difficult to get information because of the way that Putin has cracked down on independent reporting in the last couple of years, but their reporting, especially early on, was crucial in terms of both defining Prigozhin's role. There's photographic evidence of Prigozhin's role and of people who worked with Prigozhin, and also of exactly which countries they've been in and what they've been doing. There are also United Nations reports that have come out from both the Central African Republic and Libya about what the Wagner Group is doing. Russia tried to quash those reports and failed. They leaked out and then were eventually publicly published. There was also a laptop found in Libya from a Wagner Group person who was defeated and ran away and left the laptop behind. And so we have just lots of various ways of finding the information. It's not coming from one source and it's not politicized. But then on to your question, we have an immense amount of information linking the Russian Military Intelligence Agency, the GRU, to the Wagner Group. We know that their passports are on the same linked number of international passport travel coming out of the Russian travel agency. We know that their training base, their primary training base, has been located next to the primary training base for GRU special forces in Russia. We know that somebody who is a retired GRU officer founded the Wagner Group, and somebody else who is a retired GRU officer is the person in the Central African Republic working with President Touadéra and also working with the Wagner Group people there. So just in all kinds of ways, we know they're directly connected to the GRU. In terms of links to Putin himself, Prigozhin has longstanding links to Putin from the time that Putin was the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. Prigozhin got out of prison early. He was in prison for 9 years for organized criminal activities, primarily being involved in a gang that was robbing people on the street, including taking winter clothes and boots from people in the middle of the winter in St. Petersburg, which is, frigid cold in the winter, just gives you a sense of what kind of person he is. He got out of prison early. We don't know exactly why, but at that time in history, it was probably done through a deal with the KGB that he turned sides in return for getting out of prison early. He managed to set up a series of successful businesses in St. Petersburg, started as a grocery business, then opened up a chain of restaurants during the time that Putin was the person responsible in St. Petersburg for signing off on all new contracts at the time when privatization was happening. When Putin went to the Kremlin in Moscow, Prigozhin followed close behind, became a contractor for the Russian military, became a contractor for the Russian public school system, and became a contractor for catering that happened in the Kremlin. And when even George W. Bush visited Russia, Putin took him to St. Petersburg to eat at Prigozhin's restaurant. And Prigozhin has been a guest, for example, when the Libyan warlord Khalifa Haftar came to the Kremlin to talk to Russian military people about what Russia's role would be in Libya. Prigozhin was photographed being there and speaking with him. So the relationship between him and the Russian government is very strong, and between him and Putin as individuals is very strong. And although we, as far as I know, we don't have any public source information about this, we can just make a guess based on what we know about everything else that happens in Russia, that Putin is getting his own little cut from every contract that Prigozhin signs.
Great, thank you so much. Now this question will be for Paulina. What has been the impact of the withdrawal of French and US involvement on the continent in Africa? And is the Wagner Group essentially filling that vacuum?
Well, that's the idea for Mali, for sure. They've basically swapped security partners by getting Wagner in and asking the French to leave, or well, the French were already planning to leave. The French are not entirely leaving Africa. They will stay in West Africa. President Emmanuel Macron is, as we speak, devising a new strategy for the Sahel, where there will probably be some kind of redeployment of French troops to other nations close to Mali to sort of counter the jihadist threat more into coastal states in West Africa, such as Cote d'Ivoire or Benin or Niger. This happens in a context of rising anti-French sentiment in that area. So it's very delicate politically. And anyway, they're still working on that strategy. They will not leave entirely. I think for Mali, we have to see how this is going to play out. As far as we know, there's about 1,000 Wagner troops now in Mali. France had about between 3,000 or at most 5,000 soldiers, not only stationed in Mali, but a large chunk of them were in Mali. So I think there's a lot of fear, especially at the United Nations peacekeeping mission, which has also a large force in Mali. As you can see, it's highly militarized. The UN relied heavily on the French for medical evacuation, medical support, hospitals, flights in and out, and airstrikes on jihadists. And so it's not really clear if Wagner can, well, it's clear that Wagner is not going to provide security or medical evacuations for UN peacekeeping troops. All that is still, being thought out and still being planned. There has been a very worrying spate of attacks just the last 3 days or so in Mali that came very close to the capital, Bamako. A lot of suicide bombings or, in cars close to the capital. We're not really sure what that means. There were no major casualties, but it seems that the jihadist groups in Mali now feel quite re-energized by the departure of the French. And I think that a lot of nations around Mali are very worried that the jihadists might either try to get to the capital Bamako or might spread more into across the border. We don't know at this point. The US built a large airbase in Niger, where it operated together with French troops. The French might stay in that area and the airbase is still there. And the military involvement of the US has always been quite minimal. A lot of logistical support, training, things like that, but it's never been a very active presence in that part of Africa. So I think there's not going to be a US withdrawal that's going to have any effect, because I think the US troops that are still in the Sahel will probably stay, and they haven't really made a huge impact, if I can say that carefully, in terms of countering the jihadist threat. So I think there's going to be, well, I spoke about the massacre in Mali, and that was very, it was a huge shock in terms of the people who were killed in broad daylight, as I said, over the course of a couple of days by the National Army. So for sure, we're going to see more human rights violations. We're probably going to see more massacres, and we are probably going to see more attacks in Mali that will approach the capital, I think. Can the jihadists overrun the capital? I'm not really sure. What would France do if they do? We really don't know. We're going to have to see.
Thank you. And that's a bit distressing, really.
It is, yes.
Yeah. My next question is for Jack. Can you speak about how the Wagner Group uses social media and disinformation to achieve its aims? You know, I'm thinking of Russia blaming Western sanctions on grain shortages in Africa in order to raise opposition by African nations to the sanctions. So could you talk a little bit about what they do in that context?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the one aspect of sort of larger Wagner Group activities, the sort of pantheon of services they provide and activities they engage in that we haven't really touched on here. We talked about military activity, the commercial activity, but we haven't really talked about the disinformation, misinformation operations that relate to Wagner. So important to understand that Prigozhin has a long history of being heavily involved in Russian state-backed disinformation efforts. He was designated not just for his role as an oligarch and the sort of patron behind the Wagner Group, but also because he was one of the principal funder of the Internet Research Agency, more commonly known as the Troll Farm. He also has sort of a larger media apparatus that he funds that similarly engages in the same type of espousing of pro-Russian narratives. It's what you'd expect narrative-wise. Where Wagner has been involved, one of the sort of key parts of the package that they offer local governments is not only coup-proofing through security assistance, but also conducting sociological research paired with efforts to reach out to local populations and shore up support, typically for an incumbent. We saw this in Sudan, where the corporate infrastructure that followed the Wagner Group and the Russian mining company engaged there, Mirawi Gold, into the country was contracted directly to conduct that kind of research and conduct those same types of campaigns in Sudan. In the Central African Republic, this has perhaps been the most visible. It's both in terms of sort of physical propaganda, but also a lot of the coordinated inauthentic activity, coordinated inauthentic behavior that we see on social media. So these networks will pair that type of effectively astroturfed or artificial activity on social media alongside real world efforts to distribute propaganda, engage local communities, kind of at the most extreme or outrageous level. This includes production of propaganda films. A series of companies related to Prigozhin have been involved in the production of several movies that basically mythologize what Wagner is doing across Africa and in Ukraine. Most of that is fairly run-of-the-mill Russian propaganda. It doesn't really seem to have that large of a viewer base. There were some efforts made to make sure that local populations, particularly in Central African Republic, were able to view those propaganda movies, but it's not really clear where there's an effective audience for that specific type of propaganda. Where it is clear that there's a more effective audience and where there's more targeted efforts has really been around the use of both coordinated and authentic behavior on social media sites, as identified by Graphica, Stanford Internet Observatory, and social media companies themselves. Also by working with local media in countries in which Wagner is active. So we see this particularly in Libya, that involved everything from funding the creation of entirely new television stations, working closely with local media partners in order to provide them with better resources to report more effectively on narratives that were going to suit the Wagner Group, to suit the Russian interest in Libya, and particularly in this case, suit the interests of their proxy, Khalifa Haftar. We also see engagement with local actors in order to actually conduct these types of activities themselves. I believe about 2 years ago, CNN and several others exposed that networks connected with the Internet Research Agency and the sort of larger Prigozhin-related corporate infrastructure were involved in supporting efforts across Africa to effectively create this kind of inauthentic material, conduct operations, information operations on social media, contracting with companies and organizations in Africa in order to produce that material. On the sort of, I think, most sophisticated end of the spectrum in terms of the largest amount of effort, these networks leverage what in Russia would be deemed a political technologist, effectively political consultants, in order to not only do research in country, but engage with local political actors, and not only engage within social media, but also basically try to pull together constituencies that are important, whether they're business constituencies or other political constituencies in the country, and drum up support for sort of their chosen candidates. And we saw efforts by this, particularly by the sort of cluster of election observing / political fidelity nonprofit organizations under the Afrique banner, all of which ties back through their corporate infrastructure to Prigozhin's networks, and were involved in places ranging from Mozambique to South Africa, really across the entire continent. All of that has the effort of really guiding politics across Africa. Now, to the degree to which that's actually effective, I think is an open question. The degree to which that is as effective or works without or works in tandem with their security assistance, I think is also an important question. Would this network have the same kind of impact on politics within the Central African Republic had they not been as instrumental as they were to creating stability and supporting effectively the campaign of the FACA, the counterinsurgency campaign, to push beyond Bangui? I don't know if it's possible to say that. I think we can hypothesize that security assistance component is pretty critical to the success of these propaganda efforts in country. The last thing I'll say there, we need to be really careful not to discount every piece of pro-Russian media, particularly within Africa, as being a piece of Russian propaganda or coordinated and authentic behavior. In Mali in particular, we've seen a lot of organic sentiment that is very pro-Russian, very anti-French. There are ample historical reasons for this. There has been a long-standing set of political trends that account for that. And there have been actors that have been espousing these viewpoints for a long time. Now, do they have engagement with Russian actors? Are they supported by them? It's possible. But I think it's still worth us considering. And I think it's critical to being able to engage with these countries constructively, that we consider that a lot of this sentiment is actually organic, and that Russia is rather seizing on opportunities with existing pro-Russian sentiment rather than fomenting it in places where there is none.
Great, thank you so much. And then this question will be for you, Kim. Is the Wagner Group unique in the world, would you say? Do other states or group of states utilize similarly structured organizations in pursuit of their foreign policy goals?
Sure. So thanks for the question. I'd say that it's unique among wealthy countries. It looks more like what we might expect a militia to look like. In some place that has warlords on the ground, where they're trying to simultaneously control territory and get economic benefit using patronage networks, because it really is a patronage-based network. But Russia is unique in not having signed off on what's called the Montreux Accords. It's I don't remember the exact year, but it was an agreement that was made, a non-binding agreement that was made in the mid-2000s at some point for countries to agree upon how they would manage private military companies that worked with governments. It was done sort of in the aftermath of what was happening with Blackwater in the United States. And it also included China, which, you know, sort of unexpected, because China in many ways seems a little bit like Russia. But even China signed off on the Montreux Accords in terms of how states would control the private military companies working for them. And Russia is not a party to that accord. And of course, in Russia, the Wagner Group is still technically illegal, even though it's very clear that that Putin supports it. So that part of it is unique. Let me just also answer one question in the Q&A about Venezuela. In 2019, Reuters reported in an investigative report based on interviews on the ground that the Wagner Group was providing security for Nicolas Maduro when he was facing instability in Venezuela. Nobody has ever been able to confirm that. We do know that there were certainly Russian contractors, security contractors of various kinds on the ground. But some investigative reporters, including Lilia Yaporova, talked to people who said it wasn't Wagner. And what complicates things is that Candice Rondeau at New America has determined that some of the people who worked with Wagner over time have also been contractors for Rosneft security provision. And so a question was raised in Q&A, was Wagner in Venezuela in 2019? I don't think we know for sure. There were people who had worked for Wagner who were contractors on the ground. But as far as I know, nobody has ever found any interest for Prigozhin being in Venezuela. And Maduro didn't need Russia to come in to provide security support for him because his own forces and also the Cuban forces who were supporting him were very well trained in that.
Oh, okay, interesting. Actually, this is a follow-on question for you then, Kim, that's related. How is the Wagner Group significantly different than the Blackwater Group by the US in Iraq and US-funded Contras in Latin America? Are not similar mercenaries also fighting on Ukraine's side currently from the UK and the US? So what are the relevant differences, I guess?
Blackwater and what was happening in Central America are historical. And what set them apart historically from what Russia is doing now is that, as far as I know, there was never that private criminal component to it that was connected to the state and to private interests in the state. And so certainly Blackwater did some terrible things. There were certainly US military contractors in Latin America who did terrible things. They may have engaged in criminal activities, but if they engaged in criminal activities, they were not doing so on behalf of the US president as a private actor. And so that is a difference and a similarity. But as I said, the Montreux Accords really came in and set a set of guidelines that have been followed ever since. And the military contractors that work with the United States and with the United Kingdom and with other major countries have a very strong incentive to follow those guidelines because they want future business. Blackwater really got a black eye by the fact that it was in so many press reports for having committed murder and for engaging in all kinds of activities that was not something that the United States wanted to be associated with. And if you want to keep on being hired as a contractor, you don't want that on your record. And somebody who's done a lot of really good work on this is Deborah Avant. And so I would just give a shout out to her for the work that she did. She was actually somebody who helped explain the importance of the Montreux Accords and got people to agree to sign on. And there was another part of your question that, it was about Ukraine. As far as I know, the Ukrainian government is trying at least to hold up Western standards in terms of how its personnel act in the field. They do have a separate unit of people who are coming from foreign countries who are supporting them. In the case of warfare, it is always the case that there's not perfect central control over things. I think we did have a case of there being people who were associated with the Ukrainian military who did commit at least some acts of murder in terms of people who were captured Russian forces that should have been treated as captured forces under the Geneva Conventions. But as far as I know, there is not evidence that people who are associated with the US or the UK or other Western countries who are on the ground in Ukraine are acting with the knowledge and support of the Ukrainian government to carry out atrocities. And that's a distinction from the Wagner Group, which carries out atrocities everywhere it goes, just as the Russian military carries out atrocities by intentionally bombing civilians everywhere it goes. It's doing it now in Ukraine. It did it in Syria. It did it earlier in Chechnya. It's just a modus operandi for the Russians.
Yes, thank you, Kim, for pointing out that really important difference. And here's a question for any of you. Is there an area or aspect of Wagner that you think specifically begs further research? Anyone want to tackle that one?
I'm happy to jump in here briefly. I mean, I think that there's this sort of, first of all, I'll just add something briefly to what Kim said, which is something we haven't really addressed here, which is around terminology. And I'm not going to go too far into this because I think it gets extremely technical extremely quickly. Part of the difference between the foreign fighters that we see in Ukraine and actors like the Wagner Group is really around what structure they're there with and around the definition of mercenarism. Now, the definition of mercenary under international law I actually find to be incredibly restrictive. And within that definition, it's extremely difficult to call basically any of the foreign fighters that we see involved in Russia, or indeed even Wagner Group fighters involved in Russia, mercenaries, because Russia is a party to that conflict. Where we might see distinctions are where Russian private military companies are recruiting combatants from Central Asia and paying them to serve in Ukraine. Where we see foreign fighters coming in, I would definitely draw a heavy distinction between that and someone who's a mercenary or working within a private military company. If a private individual decides to fight on behalf of a foreign country, particularly within a structure like a foreign legion, that doesn't necessarily make them a mercenary, at least not under the definition under international law, within the sort of content of the Montreux document, within the content of the Geneva Convention, et cetera. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. As regards sort of questions burning questions around the Wagner Group, I think that I would fundamentally, and this is my bias, looking at this from a network standpoint and our organization's approach to trying to understand the networks behind this, really twofold. So first of all, understanding the actual infrastructure behind some of these alternative structures, particularly that we're seeing more active in Ukraine. The good example of this being recent reporting also by Yoparova with Medusa on different Russian PMC structures active in Ukraine. And not only is there the Wagner Group, there's also this group called Redout. If you look at companies in Russia called Redout, you'll find that there is a Redout Security LLC, whose executive director previously worked with a number of different Russian private security companies that are a bit more conventional, and which Kim has actually written about quite a bit, as well as Candace Rondeau at New America. Those include RSB Group, Moran Security, et cetera. If you look at where that individual who's the executive director is located, his apartment is effectively located right below the VDV division through which Redout has been deployed, meaning that VDV being airborne, this is basically a pretty clear representation for us of sort of co-location of a private company that is reportedly involved in deploying alongside regular Russian forces into Ukraine. And we can see that the executive director's listed address is right alongside where that military unit that his company allegedly works with is based. So that's just like one small piece of a puzzle. There's a much larger set of that infrastructure that is critical for us to understand in terms of particularly these more sort of MOD or GRU enabled or driven enterprises beyond just the Wagner Group and the sort of the constellation of companies connected with Prigozhin. Related to that, it's really around finance and command and control of the Wagner Group. We can say, I think, with some certainty that Ministry of Defense and particularly military intelligence takes a leading role in command and control, but understanding who those individuals actually are and what their relationship is to the commercial infrastructure, I think will be really important to understanding how the Wagner Group acts, particularly outside of Ukraine, where I think it's a little bit clearer to see that there is much less sort of direct involvement from the commercial infrastructure. That'll also be important to informing how the United States, Europe seeks to counter the Wagner Group, particularly in its engagement with countries in places like Africa. How can it work with these countries in Africa to offer a better alternative to the Wagner Group? And then finally, on the sort of finance side of things, we understand that parts of these networks are designed to generate revenue, but how much revenue is being generated? Where is it going? How much of this really, enriches Prigozhin versus supports the ongoing operations of the group? And what other commercial networks might be involved? I think that is going to be really important to understanding the sort of larger threat that this represents. In our own investigations, we found that the Wagner Group is not something that's self-contained. It's a very agile, very dispersed group of companies, none of which are called Wagner Group, by the way, which interact with, in turn, a very, very large set of both Russian and international firms in order to sustain their operations, to move people, to pay people, to move material, to conduct mining operations, to conduct political influence operations, et cetera. So the sort of broader universe of things that get touched by this are quite large. And understanding the full scope of that network is going to be critical to understanding what risk actually looks like and to having any kind of effective strategy to counter the Wagner Group, which I think gets to another question here around, has there been an effective effort to do this collaboratively? There's definitely been a lot of, I think, good efforts that have been made. Whether there's been one that's particularly effective, I think it's really going to come down to not only an effective sort of regulatory and law enforcement effort to cut these networks out of the international system of trade and finance, which is going to rely on larger efforts to commitment to doing that across the board, from the United States to secrecy jurisdictions, but also an effort to reach out to the countries that are being targeted by the Wagner Group, offer a better alternative, and frankly, take them seriously, be able to compete with the Wagner Group in these countries by being able to offer them security solutions and economic solutions that they need, that Russia is offering to give without strings attached, in a way that's plausible and which can reliably push them out of the market which they're seeking to exploit.
Well, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. There's a lot more questions that we couldn't get to, but I wanted to thank the panelists so much for a fascinating and illuminating conversation about the different components of the Wagner Group and their various activities and what we might see in the future. So I will say thank you again and turn it back to you, Courtney.
Yes, thank you, Joanna, for leading such a great discussion. Thank you, panelists. This was really fascinating. I believe, Brian, I saw a question, someone wanted to know about publications. Brian will try to follow up by sending some of the panelists' publications on this topic to participants. So you should be getting that via email. Just a few housekeeping items. I'll just take a moment to run through them very fast. Our next briefing is on Thursday. It's on whether or not South Africa's democracy has failed. So it should be a really fascinating conversation. We're doing that in partnership with the Institute of Current World Affairs. So that's this Thursday at noon. And then just a few more announcements. We do have our annual gala is coming up in September, believe it or not. We're almost at the end of July. And this is where we'll do our Innovators Awards in Global Affairs. We also have our gala. It will be in New York. We encourage everyone who is in New York to come. It's on the tail end of the General Assembly. So it's a great week just to talk about international affairs in general. The Innovators Awards are actually there. We give them out to newer organizations that are taking innovative approaches to tackling challenges that have an impact in the international affairs realm. And we are looking for nominees.
Oh, I think we might have.
What we're really trying to do is raise awareness about it. Lost me. Okay. Am I back?
You're back.
I hope. I'm
Yes,
back.
you're
Okay,
back.
great. At any rate, we can reach out to interesting organizations through our network, through people like you. So if you know companies or initiatives that are really doing interesting work worldwide in the areas of institutions and governance, economic growth, environment, communications and civic engagement, and of course, I will always forget one category, but we have them all on our website. We're looking for nominees. Please do nominate organizations because this is a great opportunity to just raise awareness about the work that they're doing, and particularly if they're aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And please, we encourage you, if you're in New York, please come. It should be a really wonderful event. So thank you, panelists. Thank you, Joanna, and thank you everyone who was asking terrific questions. Really appreciate it. Take care now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.